Hello friends, and welcome back to the Hall of Craft! So for the last couple weeks I've been cranking out the biggest build I've ever made. This massive 5-story modular tower. Links to the first two parts in the top right if you missed those. Well, now it's all assembled and it's time to paint. So let's just jump right into it. So for a build this large, I'm gonna have to mix up a fresh batch of Black Magic base coat. This is just black paint and Mod Podge. Then you just take a brush and cover absolutely everything with it. This step is essential on this kind of build because black paint just will not cut it. The Mod Podge really sinks into the foam, sinks into all your cracks and crevices, and adds a lot of strength and durability that you're really gonna be thankful for later. Plus it takes paint really well, so there's really no downside, just do it. So just throw on a podcast and go to town. You're likely gonna be painting black for at least a couple hours. Lay out some parchment paper on your workspace before you do though, because Mod Podge won't stick to it, and you can peel off your pieces afterwards without making too much of a mess. One thing to keep in mind is not to flood the insides of your doors with your base coat. You don't want to dry them shut. Cover the door, but just don't fill the hinge area. Be really thorough on this step. You don't want to miss any areas. You will inevitably miss some spots, but you can come back after to touch them up. But try to get as many as you can with the first pass. So if you remember from previous videos, we cut 20 window frames out and did nothing with them last time. Well, that was for good reason. These will also need to be base coated and painted. I'm just gonna place all of my pieces out on a baking sheet to dry and then leave them overnight. Here's what that looks like the next day. All black and ready for some dry brushing. Yeah, you heard me. I'm not using any base coats on this bad boy. I'm only dry brushing them with these makeup brushes. If episode 1 was my soapbox moment for the Kershaw Sharpener, episode 3 is my soapbox moment for cheap dollar store makeup brushes. They work awesome for blending, go figure. And now I use them on all of my terrain and minis. If you're not sold yet, just wait till you see the work they get done on this tower. I'm painting the outside of the tower first so that I can make sure all of the floors look like they belong together when assembled. The interior will be receiving the exact same colors and tones though. So to start out this paint job, we're gonna hit all of the stone with Graphite. This is perfect for your first stone color because it's a very dark blue toned gray. You're gonna leave this as your darker shadowy areas, and the blue tones add a lot of cool contrast to what will eventually be your warm toned highlights. The technique here is to load up your makeup brush with paint and wipe most of it off on a paper towel. For the first coat, would technically be overbrushing because there is still some paint on the brush. I'm doing this for faster coverage. But once we get into the lighter tones, I will be doing a better job getting all of the paint off the brush to avoid streaking or any more obvious transitions. For the next coat, I'm using gray, moving more into a dry brush style and less overbrushing, also focusing more on the highlighted areas and less on the shadows. Because the tower is a cylinder, my brightest highlights will be in the middle between the stone pillars, and my darkest areas will be right beside the pillars themselves. Also keeping in mind that my balcony would be casting a shadow, so my fourth floor would not have too many bright highlights on it. To differentiate the thick pillars from the walls themselves, I'm going to use a dark taupe on them. I will sporadically also hit a few areas of the walls with patches of the dark taupe color. This is a very similar method to my modular ruins video. I'm really loving this kind of color scheme strategy for stone. Once I'm satisfied with that, I'm going to use a light taupe on all of the areas I just hit with dark taupe, giving them their own special highlight. Now it's time for the MVP of my craft paints, suede. I will use this color on both the walls and pillars to create highlights. This last step for the stone is to highlight with vanilla. This is a very bright color, so it's important to be very gentle with your dry brushing and very intentional with where you put it. I just put it at the tops of the windows and in the middle of the curves of the tower. Also very gently highlighting the edges of my thick pillars. I'm gonna use all of those same steps on our window frames while they're still loose. Shout out to Professor Dungeon Master. I was making myself some ultimate dungeon terrain while I was in full stone mode. Off screen, I painted all of the interiors of my stories with the exact same colors and methods. Here's what those look like. It's time to paint the base. I want this to have a similar look to the stone pillars, but also be a little differentiated from the rest of the tower. So for my first coat, I'm going to use brown. Once I have nice coverage with that, I'll use a deep gray and then overbrush all of the areas that I want to look more like stone. When my brush has almost no paint left, I'll gently hit the gridded area for a little bit of highlighting. Now I will repeat the same step, but with the dark taupe and eventually the light taupe. Here is where my highlights start getting a little crazy. I bust out the suede again and then hit the tops of all the rocky areas. The vanilla comes back here also, hitting only the tops of the rocks. This adds a pretty insane amount of contrast to the base. The darks are still very dark and the highlights are almost white. I certainly went a little overboard here, but I plan on using a black wash on the whole tower, so at this point I'm just hoping that it brings it back down to a more reasonable level. So now it's time to do all of the wood. This includes the pillars, trapdoors, regular doors, and eventually the balcony. I'm going to use one of my smaller makeup brushes because these are smaller details and I don't want to get a whole lot of extra color all over the stone that I just painted. For my darkest shade, I'm using a chocolate brown. It's got some nice reddish tones to it, and this will help contrast the blue undertones of the stone. I'm just overbrushing that onto everything that is wood. If you get any brown onto your stone here despite using the smaller brush, that's still fine and you can just touch it up later with some suede. It'll cover it right up. When I get to the balcony, I'm going to switch to a bigger brush to speed things up. I actually am also going to paint the roof with chocolate brown to start. I want to paint this roof red eventually, and red has a hard time covering black, so the chocolate brown here will make a good base coat. Once that's done, I switch back to the small brush and I start over brushing all the wood with a regular brown. This will start to bring out some of the details of that wood grain that we drew. After that, I'm using a golden brown. For this, I'm making sure to only hit the highlights. And for the pillars especially, I'm coming from a downward angle and intentionally not going all the way to the bottom of the pillar. This creates a lighting effect that I quite like. So that's it for the interior wood, but for the exterior, it would be exposed to more of the elements. So it would have more of a grayish highlight. I'm gonna bust the suede back out and give the doors and the balcony a gentle brushing with that. I painted the balcony later on with all of those same steps, but after I had finished all of the small sections. This is because I was using a bigger brush and I didn't want any of my brushes to dry out while I was working. When I eventually started highlighting the balcony, I was conscious about highlighting it in a similar way that I had done to the stone, focusing the highlights on the middle areas of the cylinder and the shadows on the outer areas. The gradient transitions show through really well on the underside of the balcony, and I actually really love this look. It's time to paint the roof. If you saw my Fire Dragon video, link in the top right, I'm going to be using a lot of the same strategies from that video for painting and highlighting red. I'll start by laying out some wine red, which is a very maroon purpley like color, on top of the chocolate brown I already had. Then I'll mix some bright red and wine red together and highlight it further with that. After that, I'll use some bright red straight out of the bottle. Now here's where most people mess up when they highlight red, because light red is just pink. So I'll show you. If I were to use the same strategy as wood or stone, I would just put some vanilla into my red for the next highlight and mix that together. But here I'm just literally making pink, and I want to have a red roof, not a pink one. So what I'll actually do is use some orange and eventually yellow for my highlighted areas. It works for dragons and it's going to work for my roof. Like all the other exterior pieces, my highlighted areas will line up with the highlights of the stone, so the middle of the cylinder areas. As I get closer to yellow, I am making sure to have smaller and smaller coverage, leaving some areas with only red highlights from before. This creates a look that I really like, almost like the sunlight is hitting the roof, and it shows off all of the work we did adding texture to the shingles in the first place. Now I'm moving on to all of the metal details. For this I had planned to mix up a black with my silver craft paint, but unfortunately, as you see here, my silver was less than workable. So due to laziness or just eagerness to keep this moving, I opted not to go hit up the dollar store and instead just to use my Reaper silver and iron color paints. These are high quality and expensive, so I don't normally like to use them on terrain, but they get the job done in a pinch, and they cover super well compared to the cheap craft paints. I'm just using them on the roof cap, door handles, and metal bars on my windows. I thought about using them to cover the metal archways on the balcony, but I quickly realized that was insane and pivoted to some more bronze and gold artist paints I had left over from back in the day. This was actually a pretty happy accident because the bronze archways added a nice bit of difference in the metal tones. I find that using the same metal tone over and over again on either your miniatures or your terrain build is an easy trap to fall into because it's less work and you're using less different paints, but using different colors actually makes something look more realistic because there's more variety and it just gives you a better result. It feels more intentional. So that's the basic paint coat finished. Now I'm going to move on to the wash, and like the base coat, this is going to use a lot more ingredients than I have just pre-mixed. So I'll show you what my mix looks like. For this I'm just using what's left of my flow improver and then roughly mixing 50-50 water and matte medium. Then I'm just going to start adding a bunch of brown and black acrylic inks until I'm satisfied with the shade. I have an old piece of rock terrain handy, and I'm just testing my new wash batch and comparing it to the stuff that I have already for consistency. To be extra safe, once I thought the wash was in a good place, I used it on all of my loose window frames first. This looked pretty good, so I felt safe to use it on the tower itself. So I'm just switching to a larger brush and totally covering all of everything but the roof in this wash. It's a bit of a process and it's going to take a while to dry, but this does a really excellent job of making your paint job look professional, as long as you don't let it pool in any weird areas. The vanilla highlights get brought down to more reasonable level, and it also pools in the details, making them pop out, increasing your contrast. Okay, once everything is fully coated and it's drying, it's time to finally put those window frames to use. I will start by taking this piece of scrap clear plastic that I've been saving. Right now it's totally transparent, but I want it to be translucent, so I'm going to rough it up a bit with some sandpaper. Then I'm going to take my MDF window template and trace it out 20 times. After that's done, we cut them all out with scissors. Wait till your windows have dried, but then it's time to trim the plastic to size, making sure that it's totally covered by the frames. And then we'll just be hot gluing them into place on the back of the frame. Now we just take all those completed window frames and glue them into place on the inside of our tower floors to line up with the holes. And there it is, you've got some cute ass little windows. So that's it, you've got a fully functioning tower. You could stop right here and coat this whole thing with clear coat and you'd have a very functional modular tower to use for your D&D games. But I want to take it one step further. So I want to add a little extra juice to this thing, and my art director gave me a pretty fantastic idea when she asked me if I was going to paint the floors a different color. So my official Archon mini had just come in, so I guess I had Tiamat on the brain, because I started thinking, 5 floors, 5 heads, 5 colors of the chromatic dragons. It lined up too perfectly to pass up. So I decided I could paint all of the floors in ascending order of the colors of the chromatic dragons, from white, black, green, blue, red on the top floor. This opened up quite a bit of possibilities to me. It made the piece more interesting and had more playable options to it that could also be ignored if I wanted to just use it as a generic wizard tower. It's not so absurd that each of the floors has a different color, but now the option is open to me if I want to make this some kind of Tiamat themed boss dungeon where each floor has a different effect because it's imbued with draconic energy. So I could give this to my boy Archon and turn this tower in from a generic wizard's tower to Tiamat's Tower of Tyranny. So to do this, I figured floor 1, white dragon, I could just re-dry brush the floor with some vanilla. That one was easy. For the black, it was a little more tricky. I started by just dry brushing with black, but it really lost all of the detail and I was not stoked about that. The tiles were hard to distinguish from each other. So I ended up mixing a purple tone and just roughly edge highlighting the tiles with that. This did a pretty good job bringing back the grid, so I moved on to the next floor. Floor 3 is green, so I just dry brushed with, you guessed it, green. And after that, blue got blue, and red got a similar red to the roof. Unsure if I was happy with that result, I set those aside for a bit and decided to add some grass tufts to the base of the tower using some super glue and a pair of tweezers. I'm just using a mix of summer and dead grass together, putting them wherever I feel like. Nice, okay, I feel a little better about myself now. That looks good. After thinking about it, I decided that I've come this far and that I should just put in the effort to do these floors justice, and add some more highlights to them so they don't look so flat. For the top floor, I'm going to use bright red and then orange to highlighting it, focusing my highlights towards the middle of the floor and working their way out. That looks so much better. Time to do the same strategy on the green and blue floors. This really brings back a lot of the texture and makes it look so much better. And that's it, friends. TIAMAT'S Tower of Tyranny is finally complete. I hope you enjoyed the build. This was by far the largest and most complicated craft I've made so far, and I'm pretty proud of how it turned out, to be honest. I cannot wait to see my players try and ascend these steps as they make their way to negotiate with Archon. Or just use it as a generic wizard tower. I think this thing is pretty versatile, and I hope to get a lot of use out of it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this build. Let me know what you think of this kind of format in the comments. If you like this kind of like step-by-step big build breakdown, or if you prefer to see like smaller self-contained videos. I'd love to know what you guys think. If you enjoyed this video, I've got plenty of other crafting and painting videos that you could check out. I'll see you guys in my next video. Have a great week.